Hello people! Pokemon used to put out a lot of spin-off games in the first 4 or so gens, but they've slowly been declining since the start of the modern era. Of course, we still get them every now and then, but they're not as prominent and frequent as back in the day. This could be for a bunch of reasons. For once, many of those older spin-offs didn't sell all that well for Pokemon standards, so the Pokemon company might have judged that they're not worth funding, especially since nowadays there's mobile apps like Pokemon Go that make huge amounts of money. Why hire studios to develop new games from the ground up when it's easier, faster, and less resource taxing to drop updates to your live service games like Go, Masters, and TCG Pocket and make more money than those spin-offs would anyway? Another thing worth noting is that in the modern era, new mainline games are coming out nearly every year. This leaves less room for spin-offs as they are no longer necessary to keep Pokemon in the minds of consumers. They already have enough mainline games to play. From a player perspective, regardless of how you feel about modern Pokemon, the games have been feeling more creative and experimental, especially with the Legend series. The reason I'm bringing this up is because one of the uses spin-off games used to have is that they would scratch an itch that the core games couldn't because of the strict formula and genre they were boxed inside of and limited to. When all mainline games stick to a certain specific kind of gameplay, players may get the urge to experience Pokemon in different formats, and that's where spin-offs would come into play. This is no longer as needed because mainline games have become more flexible and rich in features. Why release a Snap-style game when you can already take pictures of Pokemon with your Rotom phone? Why put out another mystery dungeon when you can play as Pokemon using the Synchro Machine? Why make a real-time combat spin-off when there's a Legends game that already has that? You understand what I'm getting at. In spite of all this, I think Pokemon spin-offs can be a thing of beauty. Some of my favorite Pokemon games aren't even part of the mainline. I love the Ranger and Snap series, and I had lots of fun with the Ore games and Pokken. In recent years, the main problem fans of the franchise have identified with main series Pokemon is that the games have been pretty unpolished and rushed. Lots of people cited the tight development schedule as the source of this problem, saying that they can't release polished games because they have to keep up with pumping out a new title every year. Spin-offs could be the solution to this problem. Need a new game this year? Let a different studio make a spin-off and allow Game Freak to focus their resources on next year's game. Want new Pokemon to release every year for the sake of marketing and merch? Just let spin-offs introduce a couple new mons. You can add them to the next mainline game anyway when that comes out. Want to breathe new life into the franchise and reach new audiences? Make more Pokemon spin-offs. I want to present to you a couple ideas I have for potential Pokemon spin-off games that could be made in the future. Note that I did not come up with these based on how likely they are to happen or anything. I'm not trying to predict anything here. These are merely ideas that I find interesting and would like to see in the future. This video is a bit of a thought experiment aimed to show you how much potential Pokemon can have outside of the boundaries of the main series. It's meant to spur creativity and create discussion. The first game I came up with that honestly I'm surprised they haven't attempted is the Pokemon Pet Simulator. Ever since Pokemon X and Y, every generation introduced a new feature where you can play with and feed your Pokemon like you would with a real pet. X and Y had a Me, Sun and Moon had Refresh, Sword and Shield had camps, and Scarlet and Violet has picnics. The problem is, every version of this feature has something that the others lack, meaning that there is no definitive version of the concept. A Me and Refresh use the 3D touchscreen to allow you to pet your Pokemon in a tactile way, which isn't a thing with camps and picnics. Refresh also lets you cure status conditions. On the other hand, camps and picnics allow you to play with multiple Pokemon at once and have more intricate cooking mechanics for feeding your Pokemon. Plus, those games give you toys for your mons. Furthermore, regardless of how fun these features are, they will always be secondary to the main gameplay loop. Really, they're more like optional mini-games than anything else. And so, I ask you, how cool would it be if there was a side game completely dedicated to and focused on taking care of your Pokemon? Imagine a definitive, fully developed version of the Pokemon pet care concept with immersive graphics and mechanics that expands upon all the iterations of the idea from the mainline games. This game would have the tactile petting from the 3DS era and the toys and intricate meals from the Switch era, plus more. A game like this wouldn't need expansive maps, battle mechanics, or even much of a story. Those resources would instead go into polishing the Pokemon models and animations and making the caretaking experience as immersive and fun as possible. Expressiveness and charm would be the main goals in this Pokemon Pet Sim. Imagine petting your Arcanine and feeling how the vibration in your Joy-Con becomes more intense when you touch its rougher textured mane, or how you'd feel no vibration at all when petting a smooth or incorporeal Pokemon. If you really want to go all out with this idea, how nice would it be if the game was compatible with Home and you could actually play and bond with your team members from your mainline playthroughs? Hell, maybe a pet sim like this could even feature every Pokemon in it and update when new mons are introduced. Should be possible with enough development time, especially since the game would be solely focused on the Pokemon themselves and not much else. They're making a spin-off focused on the battle, so why not make one focused on playing with your Pokemon? I think this idea has the potential to sell really well. There's so many people out there who only care about Pokemon because of the creatures themselves. People who buy merch like plushies and cards just to feel a little bit closer to their favorite monster. A game like this might be perfect for this crowd, and it may get them into Pokemon games when the main series otherwise would not. We all know that, if nothing else, Pokemon is amazing at character and creature design. A game like this would make full use of that. This idea is admittedly similar to a game that Pokemon was apparently going to make at some point because it involves riding on Pokemon, but I think it's worth talking about regardless. I'm talking about a Pokemon racing game. The main thing I'd like to avoid with a game like this is turning it into a Mario Kart clone with a Pokemon paint job. One way this could be achieved is by not having power-ups. Let me explain. Pokemon are known for having unique powers, right? So what if instead of power-ups obtained mid-race that any player can use, the game relies on moves unique to the Pokemon that the player chooses to ride in a race? Maybe someone riding a Mudstail would have the ability to splash mud on other players and hinder their visibility. Perhaps someone riding Rapidash could get temporary speed boosts, and maybe a Zebstrika rider could zap opponents and temporarily stun them, slowing them in the process. The tools you have access to in a race are determined by the choices you make before the race even starts, allowing for more strategy. Furthermore, I think the game should have ways of incentivizing the player to bond with the Pokemon they ride. This could mean being able to level up specific Pokemon to make them faster or increase their stamina, teaching them new moves to use during the race, or maybe even some sort of visual customization. The reason I think this is important is because in this game you're using Pokemon, not vehicles. They are not machines, they're loyal companions. It just works better with the overall message of the franchise. I also think that investing time and resources into specific Pokemon discourages the player from arbitrarily picking any random Pokemon before every race. It develops unique playstyles. As for the Pokemon themselves, I would like the possible picks to be diverse. I already mentioned the obvious equine Pokemon, but I'd like to see some weirder options as well. I want to see people ride in on their Galvantula. I want to see someone posted on top of a Stakataka, or somebody being carried by their Machamp like in Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. Really, any Pokemon big enough to carry a person would be game. I think a Pokemon racing game should embrace the varied roster of creatures in this franchise. When it comes to racetracks, I think it would be cool if they were based on locations in the Pokemon world from the core series, like a course based on Viridian Forest or one based on Mount Coronet. I think it's more interesting than just having the tracks be based on generic biomes. Regardless of what the courses are, the obstacles and gimmicks of each track would partly center around wild Pokemon. Perhaps you'd have to dodge a Mungus' spores in a jungle race and hop on or over a Wailord during a beach race to gain some bounce. I would want a game like this to not only feature Pokemon as rides, but actually feel like it's set in the Pokemon world. It would be a different, more leisurely way to interact with it, where the focus is on dynamic fun and movement. The story can be pretty simple. You're an up-and-coming new Pokemon racer, and you travel the world to participate in various competitions. You can have a professor-type character who also plays the role of your manager that introduces to you the various concepts and mechanics of the game. You know, a tutorial character. There could even be a rival character, maybe someone cocky with slightly more experience than you, who acts all smug but that you end up surpassing by the end of the main story. But if having locations from other games serve as courses sounds too ambitious, the game could instead be set in its own new region. That might make it easier to introduce all these characters since they have their own self-contained setting. The game would also not be restricted by any conventions about the world of the main series then. My final proposed concept for a Pokemon game may be a little harder to grasp, but bear with me. To explain my idea, I first need to acknowledge how much freedom mainline Pokemon gives you. You have hundreds of picks for your party. Leveling up and evolving is determined by how you play the game or how much grinding you choose to do. You have dozens of moves you can pick for your party members, and all Pokemon games, even non-open world ones, have a fully available world where virtually every location you discover you can also backtrack to whenever you want. The game doesn't end with the credits, and you are free to go wherever you want after you beat the main story, and the story is there, but you can choose how you want to tackle it and the pace at which you want to do so. Even your character is silent, a blank slate that invites you to project your own personality onto. The plot is rarely personal, and it tends to revolve around the story and characters that exist outside of the protagonist. It's more like you're witnessing and intervening in a story rather than the story being about you. What I'm about to propose is a smaller scope Pokemon games that gives you less freedom and fewer options, but puts all those resources into story and presentation. A fully linear Pokemon game with a tightly written story and a character-driven narrative rather than a world-driven one. This game would funnel you from one linear area to another with each chapter of the story without having to worry about open routes and cities that you need to be able to backtrack to. Within these chapters, you'd encounter different characters and story events, and based on the choices that you make and the paths you take, your party would look different. Chapter 1 would allow you to pick your first partner Pokemon just like in a main series game, but instead of being able to freely add and swap team members as you please whenever you want, each chapter of the game would result in a new character being recruited to your party. Each of them would have their own unique Pokemon partner, so depending on which character ends up joining you based on the choices you make in the story, your final team of trainers will be different. Things like evolution would be scripted story events that occur at predetermined moments to enhance the narrative. Every trainer you end up recruiting would have their own backstory and reason for joining you, making each edition meaningful and narratively interesting. A bit like how in the anime, Ash takes whole episodes to get to know and capture new team members. By removing the freedom from the player, this game would be able to focus on providing a highly thought out and purposeful narrative. The timing and circumstances around the events that occur would not be entirely up to you, and so they would be handled in a way that best enhances the story. The game would also ideally look more beautiful and dramatic. I used to see other games with rosters made up of multiple characters where their movesets and animations looked a lot better and more polished than with Pokemon. This was possible because games like that only had a couple dozen characters instead of hundreds. This hypothetical Pokemon game would only have a few playable Pokemon, so all of their animations would be tailor-made for them with greater attention to detail. The story itself would be more personal to the player, and the protagonist would be a fully developed character with dialogue and a set personality. We would be playing as somebody, not just a blank slate. The game's locations may become inaccessible once the story moved on from those areas or all the events were triggered. Even if backtracking is possible, then the areas would be smaller and more linear with a focus on defeating enemy Pokemon and trainers or solving puzzles to traverse them. They'd be one and done as opposed to being open-ended like in the mainland regions, but also richer and more interesting, eventful, and action-packed. I imagine the combat in a game like this would be similar to the core games except perhaps in real time and featuring fewer options for attacks. More action than strategy. Like I said, the hypothetical games mentioned in this video were not conceived based on plausibility. They are merely fan-made pitches meant to inspire you and point out how much ground Pokemon is yet to tread when it comes to spin-offs. And remember that these ideas are meant to be spin-offs. I know they stray quite far from the main series conventions, but that's because they aren't supposed to be part of the main series. If you have any creative ideas for Pokemon spin-offs or even just existing spin-offs that you think should get new sequels, then don't be afraid to mention them in the comments. Also, I'd appreciate it if you dropped a sub. I'm trying to grow the channel. But regardless of whether you do that or not, thank you for your time.